and Laura Endicott, and we're talking for the second time now about the history of the Isreal-Hamas War. So we started all the way back in the 1890s and worked our way through to the 1949-ish around-ish with the creation of the State of Israel, and then the following breakout or slow gradual breakout of the war between Israel and the surrounding Arab states. And let's jump right back in. What happened then?
Okay, so once the State of Israel is created, there is no State of Palestine created for a variety of reasons. One, the Palestinians rejected because they didn't want partition, and after that, it never fully finalizes. That then leads to the refugee problem. About, numbers vary, and you can help me out on this, 600 to about 750,000.
Yeah, I think that ended up with being both this conflict and the Six-Day War.
Yes. Who are people that are basically forced out of either from fleeing the violence or later being relocated out of the territories that became controlled by Israel. They form refugee camps in what is today Gaza, and they basically have stayed there since.
Right, yeah.
Now they're cities instead of refugee camps.
Instead of tent cities.
Yeah. And then the Arab nations sort of reject acknowledging the existence of the State of Israel. Do we want to add anything else to that before we jump forward to 56?
No, I mean, that's going to be the persistent problem is that the Arab states refuse to recognize Israel, and not only refuse to recognize it, some of them are bent on the destruction of
it. Yes.
Is the part simply because the State of Palestine wasn't created at the same time, or is it simply because of open anti-Semitism, or what could be the reasons for this open wish to destruct the State of Israel?
To me, it's mostly about the land, the territory.
It's mostly about the territory.
Okay. I'm sure you have random people that it was just anti-Semitism, but it was mostly about the land, the loss of economic stability, especially farming land, the international influence, the money coming in with the Israelis is greatly different than the amount of money coming into Arab areas. Yeah. So it's really about land, power, economics, more so than really anti-Semitism. Now you will see the rhetoric anti-Semitic.
Yes.
But it's rhetoric. That's a way to rile people up. That's not really the root of the problem and the root of the anger. Yeah. And that leads to a bunch of instability. Remember, during all of this, all those mandates that Professor Endicott spoke of last time, are slowly gaining their independence during all of this, and they're gaining their independence under the leadership of people that the French and the British chose. And once the British and the French leave, there's instability in those countries, resulting in the overthrow of a lot of the regimes. So really throughout the 50s, you see Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, they're all gaining independence and they're all having instability. And that leads us to Egypt. Egypt is one of those areas where, while they had been independent, they had a feudalistic system controlled by a king who favored the British policies very heavily. And he is basically overthrown in 1952 by his military under the leadership of a man named Naguib, who then is basically... I don't know if he was overthrown so much as just ousted, by Gamal Nasser, who takes over. Nasser did not approve of the heavily British, pro-leaning British monarchy, and he decides to change some policies, including the control of the Suez Canal, which he proceeds to take over in 56.
56, yeah.
And of course, the British had helped build that. There was an actual, I don't remember what the corporation was called that actually owns the Suez Canal, but Nasser basically nationalizes it, which means money coming in from the use of that goes to Egypt and not this corporation that basically had investors. As you can imagine, that doesn't sit well with the British. Meanwhile, the British and the French have secretly been talking with the Israelis about helping the Israelis gain more territory while taking care of this Nasser situation with the Suez. And so Israel secretly, well, doesn't secretly, they openly attack and invade the Suez, or the Sinai Peninsula. The next day, the French and the British ask for a ceasing in the invasion, but they're still secretly backing up Israel on it. And that leads to a series of events where Eisenhower attempts to negotiate an end to this. The Soviets get involved. In the end, Nasser is going to gain some help from the Soviet Union, gaining military equipment to fight back against the Israelis. And then in October, the British actually engage in the fight as well.
Right.
That lasts, what, 6 days?
Yeah.
Yeah. And at the end of the 6 days, the British have now occupied the Sinai Peninsula, and Egypt doesn't gain its control over the Suez. It's internationalized for a little while, isn't it?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Because the British, I mean, the whole, it's a debacle for the British
It is.
in the end when it comes to, I mean, because they would desperate. I mean, again, I mean, they'd like to hold on to the Suez Canal. I mean, they've got this long, historical attachment to it. But back at home in Great Britain, how much interest they have, the populace has in holding on to the Suez Canal is like, okay. So I mean, Great Britain doesn't have its empire anymore.
No.
So so the whole thing, we're holding on to India, we're to get access to Africa. That it's not as important as it used to be.
It's not as necessary.
And as long as international traffic is allowed, I mean, Egypt has to have the Suez Canal open, so it's not going to necessarily block people from going through it.
Yeah, but
Which
they
was-
just keep the change, basically.
Yes. Yeah.
Keep the money.
Yeah.
Which was a part I forgot to throw in there, is that Nasser, when he was angry at the British invasion, he basically sunk a massively large ship in the middle of the Suez to prove that he could do it.
Yeah.
So in the end, the negotiations end up that the Egyptians have to promise to keep the Suez open to everyone because they were intending to cut Israel off.
Yeah.
So that sort of creates an international situation for the British. The other result of all of this is, while Nasser really didn't gain anything from doing all of this in terms of land, he does gain the admiration of the other Arab nations because he stood up to Israel and he stood up to the Europeans who were backing Israel. And that's going to lead to more Arab nationalism. Nasser will be sort of one of the figureheads of this sort of pan-Arab movement, which will lead to 2 more wars in the late 60s. For the rest of the 50s, you have these destabilized countries sort of struggling. And one of the reasons that Lebanon, Syria, even Jordan are destabilized is the Palestinian refugees who have fled Israel, the ones who don't end up in the Gaza area, have fled across the borders into Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and they're still angry, and they still do sort of hit and run attacks across the border back into what is Israel. And so Israel will retaliate repeatedly by, lobbing a few missiles into Lebanon or Jordan or Syria, and then that foments hostility within those countries against their own government, who aren't standing up to the Israelis who are bombing them because the Palestinians are bombing the Israelis. So it's one of these tit for tat, back and forth, crossing border sort of situations for about a decade. And the only regime that manages to survive this is King Hussein of Jordan. Almost gets toppled, but he manages to sustain, basically because he starts backing away from the Arab-Israeli problems and focusing on his relationship with the U.S. And gaining some much-needed economic help to stabilize his country. And then that fast forwards into 1967. And wait, what did we skip?
The PLO 64.
Oh, yes, 1964. The Palestinian Liberation Organization is formed. Originally as an organization, well, on paper, an organization that is supposed to represent the Palestinian people, even though they do not have a nation, they have sort of a governing representative body.
A little bit like we see it in Palestine today.
Yes. Yeah. In fact, the PLO actually sort of morphs into the Palestinian Authority. They're part of that for a while. But the PLO is factionalized within it. So there is this political entity that they actually, I think by 72, 73 are given a non-voting seat in the UN. So they're allowed to represent Palestinian interests. They just don't have a vote in anything at the UN. But within the within the PLO, which Yasser Arafat is one of the founding members, they are factionalized, and some of the members are very radical, and they tend to form subgroups that we have mostly labeled terrorists. So it's problematic. The theory is good. The creation of it isn't necessarily that great. And the PLO starts not only working on a diplomatic level to try to gain international help for the Palestinian issues, they're also engaging in these cross-the-border terrorist activities. And it morphs into some very openly hostile terrorist activities. They hijacked a few airplanes, and in those hijackings, they didn't blow the airplanes up. They blew up the airplanes after they got the people off.
Right.
They used the people as hostages to try to get PLO prisoners in Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, wherever, out of jail. They do end up bombing, I don't think that's till 88, the Tel Aviv flight.
Oh,
The
that's
flight
88,
going to
yeah.
that's an 88.
I think that's 88.
So yeah, they kind of ratchet up over the decades.
So, but that what came from Palestine, right?
Yes.
What about the Gaza Strip at that time? Was it basically still like a refugee camp,
Yeah,
or did
more
it
or less,
already
yeah.
had some sort of organization, or?
Yeah.
Is it at that point under the Israelis?
I think it's
Or
under
is
the
it still
Israelis
under-
because
yeah.
there's a point where the Israelis are going to negotiate where they're going to give up the Gaza Strip and make it more independent
Yes.
under the Palestinian Authority.
And for a while, it was under Egyptian control.
Yeah.
So it kind of flopped back and forth. No, it never independent
Yeah.
on its own.
Yeah.
So the PLO sort of exists without a country,
Yeah.
if you will.
Yeah.
And then that leads us to the 67. Now, am I right on this? Okay.
Yeah, we're at the 67 War, the 6-Day War.
You want to take the 6-Day War over?
Sure,
Okay.
sure. Okay. As Professor Bruce has noted, is that we still have you still have a lot of anger, frustration over the situation. Nasser is now in the position that with the increased Arab nationalism, which we've talked about last time, he's now kind of the leader of all this, and he's like there's some pressure on him to act. And Syria, Jordan, and Egypt have all been kind of helping the Palestinian guerrillas at that point, as they were called. And so Nasser begins to kind of put forces on the Sinai Peninsula, and he's under tremendous pressure to act, to make some type of statement. And he closes the is it the Gulf of Aqaba to basically Israel, and Israel's convinced that a strike against them, understandably, because they're amassing these forces along their borders, that a strike against them is going to happen. So on June 5th, 1967, we get the 6-Day War, and the first thing is Israel carries out these crippling airstrikes against and just pretty much destroying the Arab air capabilities. And just this is where this is a game changer, because this is where Israel is going to push deep into into everybody else's territory. They're going to go into the Sinai Peninsula. They are going to go within, like, I think 60 miles of Damascus, and they're going to push deep into the West Bank. Pretty well much territory that had been set aside, you know, in the original partition for the possibility of a Palestinian state. Israel takes most of it. I mean, they go into Jerusalem. This is when they go into Jerusalem, and they take. And this is where, and they'll always say this after all these land gains. They'll always say that Jerusalem is non-negotiable. What they got is non-negotiable. The rest of it is almost like a bargaining chip, you know, and because what they do is they take the land, for the most part, that have been designated for the Palestinians. They win it. Now here's what's interesting. By the time we get to 67, you've had some changes in warfare, in the sense that war used to be always about gaining territory. And if I want it, it's mine. I get to take it. But by the time this happens, and as we've noted before, you know, as Dr. Bruce noted, we're fighting over something that's about the size of Rhode Island here. And so the thing is that, can Israel, I mean, like I said, it's a bargaining chip, but can Israel take this land? I mean, even if they, in a sense, ran it over, occupied it, and is it theirs? And that's going to be the big question. I mean, and this is where you get this, you know, we're not at the settlement issue yet, but this is where you're going to get the big arguments over the settlements. Okay, Israel won this territory in the 6 Day War, but is it legitimately theirs, or should they return it? And this is going to be part of the crux of the problem that we're facing today. Happened all the way back in 1967 with the 6 Day War, which Israel easily wins. Israel hardly loses anybody. Israel loses about 779 people, but the Arab League, as it was known as, loses 21,000. And this is known as the catastrophe in the Arab world, the 6 Day War. It's a humiliating defeat, and like I said, it allows Israel to this is where they get all the land. This is where, and this is the land that is going to be continually under basically negotiation even up today. And like I said, Israel's saying when they take all the land, okay, we're willing to negotiate about this other stuff, but we're not willing to ever negotiate about Jerusalem. Jerusalem is now ours, and pretty much because they take Old Jerusalem, they take East Jerusalem from Jordan, and so anyway, it's like I said, it was a resounding defeat. It adds to the Palestinian refugee problem. Additional 700,000 Palestinians are added to it, and the heroes for it will be Yitzhak Rabin, because we'll talk about him later. And Moshe Dayan. And Moshe Dayan was the guy that had the and I don't know if he lost his eye I don't think he lost his eye during the 6 Day War, but Moshe Dayan, is a figure I really remember because he would be splashed all over Time magazine, Newsweek magazine. He's the guy with the big eye patch, and so he was considered the hero. But so is Yitzhak Rabin. But Yitzhak Rabin will view his role in that as, when it comes to much later negotiations, that since he's the guy who won it, he's the guy that has, in a sense, a moral right to negotiate over it. And his thing is going to be that, hey, we probably need to give some of this back. We can't hold on to it.
Yeah.
So anyway.
Okay, so it ends.
Yeah.
And there are calls from the UN during this to negotiate into all of this and go back to a UN resolution 242, which was the original partition plan that would, in theory, give Palestinians a homeland in what is today Gaza and the West Bank, which, for those of you who don't know, it's the one that looks like the kidney bean.
Yeah.
This, at the end of this 67, these are all territories that now Israel is occupying. So it's really up to a negotiation involving the Palestinians and the Israelis, and the Palestinians tend to be left out of negotiations. It's usually between Egypt and Israel with international involvement. The Palestinians tend to get forgotten in these negotiations, and so because of that, they never, the Palestinian various factions and the PLO themselves, they never really quit cross-border attacking. And Israel never stops doing the cross-border retaliations. So it just keep that in mind all the way through the next 40 plus years. You're going to have these sort of back and forth.
Maybe let's ask this way. Was there any time since the creation of the state Israel where there was no fighting at all?
I would say no.
Yeah, I mean, yeah,
I guess it depends on your definition. There's always some level of violence.
Some
always some
violence.
Yeah.
And the other thing I'd like to note is, you know, when it comes to the Palestinian state, you have Gaza on one side and the West Bank on the other, with Israel in between.
Yeah.
And so that's going to make for an awkward situation in itself, given the map. You know, it's like, okay, here's Gaza, here's West Bank, and Israel is in between.
Yeah, it's in between. And remember, you know, the entire area is about the size of Rhode Island, but Gaza itself is this skinny stretch that if you took Washington, D.C. and you doubled it and stacked it on top, that's Gaza. So we're not talking about a lot of territory.
Yeah.
And right now there's 2 million people living there. Yeah. So it's an overcrowded area that a lot of humans live in. This fighting never sort of slows down. And you get a series of these back and forth fights. In the early 70s, foreign countries will start funding the growth of militaries. The Soviets supply Egypt with a whole lot of I can't remember, MiGs, which are the airplanes.
Yeah, MiGs, yeah.
The U.S. will then sort of prop up Israel's Air Force. At one point, the Saudi Arabians start asking for assistance. They will get that from Ronald Reagan to build up their military, especially Air Force. So the few years after 67, you start to see these militaries sort of stockpiling, and it's going to explode again in 73 because of a series of events involving another terrorist, a bit of activity, which I believe you would like to pick up on.
Yeah. So I'm gonna talk about an event that, you know, I personally remember, that I was old enough to remember, and that is, and this is going to be important because it's, you know, as Dr. Bruce has already mentioned, Jordan is actually seeking a closer relationship with the United States, and what's going to happen is this is going to pretty much throw Jordan into the arms of the United States, and ironically, assistance from Israel. As Dr. Bruce has already mentioned, you have all this cross-border action on the West Bank of the Jordan River, and the PLO under Yasser Arafat has a huge presence in Jordan, to the point is threatening the stability of Jordan and threatening the Hashemite dynasty under King Hussein. King Hussein has basically done a lot to basically accommodate the Palestinians. The Jordanian population, I think, is 60% Palestinian even today, and so he's trying to do a lot to accommodate. But the PLO under Yasser Arafat wants to take down King Hussein and basically take Jordan, and so he's like, wait a minute, you can't do that. But he's trying to kind of balance that out, because he doesn't want an out war with the Palestinians within his own country. He doesn't want a civil war. But what happens is, as Dr. Bruce has already mentioned, is, you know, in the early 70s we get the hijacking period. It's something we really don't think about too much. It tends to be, unfortunately, fairly rare now. But in the 70s, it was the favorite way for all these militant groups to try to make a point. And like I said, in militant groups, I am talking about the Baader Meinhof gang in Germany. I'm talking about the Red Brigade in Italy, the IRA. You know, the IRA didn't really I think, do too many hijackings, or if any. But those groups did. They loved hijacking. And they did it in sympathy with the Palestinians. And so what happens is that you have 3 planes. Well, actually, they tried to hijack 6 planes, but they get 3 of them to Jordan. And it's the old, TWA and Pan Am. And I think the other one was an Israeli flight. And they get it. And they take everybody off. They're trying to use some people for negotiation, but then they boldly, it's called the Dawson Airfield, and they blow up these planes. They got everybody off, but they boldly blow them up. And King Hussein, by this point, has had enough. And he desperately, of all countries he turns to Israel. He turns to Israel. Can you help us out? All of a sudden, Jordan, which has been helping, especially, during the 6-Day War and all this stuff, is now like, okay, the PLO has become a problem. And he reaches out to the United States. Richard Nixon sends some of, what we have in the area a little bit closer. But his thing is like, this might be your problem. If you want to ask the Israelis to help you against the PLO, you can go ahead. So this has been a huge turn of events, because Jordan had been supporting the PLO. But now that the PLO wants to essentially dethrone Hussein and pretty much take over the country, and this group that's really going to be a part of this is a splinter group. We have all these splinter groups, splinter group of Fatah, and they call themselves, eventually they're going to call themselves Black September. But this particular group is the Popular Front of the Liberation, Palestinian Liberation, or something like that.
It's a long name.
Yeah, and they're the ones who blow up the airplanes. And so what happens is you get about a 2-week war called the Black September War in September of, I think it's 1970, before the Yom Kippur War. And with the help, clandestine help of Israel and the United States, King Hussein basically is able to kick these more radical organizations out. And where do they go? They go to Lebanon, and they start setting things up in Lebanon, because for the most part they've been kicked out of Jordan as a base. Now the only other thing I'll say is that you get this group called Black September that's formed as a result of this, and they will be most notoriously known for what happens in the 1972 Munich Olympics, where they kidnap and hold hostage, Israeli athletes, and there's all sorts of negotiations. They demand, to get out, and they take them to the airport. Instead, what happens is there's a shootout, and then they blow up one of the helicopters, and in the end, you have 11 Israeli athletes and 1 German policeman dead. But that whole debacle in 1972, the Olympics there in Munich, that whole debacle actually gains Israel a great deal of sympathy. And because all of a sudden it's like, wait a minute, as somebody there were 3 channels back then in the old days, and they all covered it, and everybody was hoping, for the safety of the athletes. And then when it just turns into a debacle and they're all killed, and it's like I said, it generates a great deal of international sympathy for Israel. So when you get the next war, the Yom Kippur War, and I'll let Dr. Bruce take up with that.
So fast forward a year, October of 73, the Arab League has been really pushing Egypt to retaliate, I guess you could call it, and try to regain some of the territory that they had lost in the 67 war, and basically pressure from various groups, including Iraq, Morocco, the Saudis. They decide to go ahead and engage in another war. They do it on the Day of Atonement it's a Jewish holiday. They invade. It's a surprise attack from basically all sides.
Yeah.
And they have a lot of gains at the very beginning, because Israel is really caught off guard. But it turns out to not work out so well, because once Israel realizes what's happening and gets themselves organized, they're able to push all of those forces back out. So it turned out not to be the best move on the part of the Arabs. It destabilizes a lot of other things, but it does pull in some interesting twists. The U.S. and the Soviets actually worked together to try to get this one under control, which is rare during the Cold War. Although at one point, I believe the Soviets offered to help nuke things.
Yeah,
which
yeah.
we asked not to have that happen.
Yeah.
What am I missing?
I was going the oil crisis, basically. Yeah, the
yes.
OPEC.
Basically, as a retaliation for Westerners, in particular the U.S., not assisting the Arabs in their quest to find a homeland for the Palestinians, OPEC decides now that's the controlling interest of oil, because the U.S. is now a consumer nation, not a producing nation at that point. They decide to cut off anybody that doesn't support them, and it causes a massive oil crisis here in the U.S. and across Europe as well, devastating our economy for a while.
Yeah.
And causing a series of other issues across Europe, leading to a rethinking of U.S. policy towards the Middle East. But at that time, you're looking at also Nixon is now being forced to resign, and Gerald Ford is becoming president. And through all of that, the Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, who just passed away yesterday, is sort of guiding the foreign policy, and he has remained very pro-Israel. So it kind of puts the U.S. in the situation where we need to appease for oil purposes, but they're really trying to work hard to gain some sort of settlement. And Kissinger really does focus on, let's go back to that resolution 242, partition, things to this effect. It doesn't necessarily work out very well. In the end, it stays basically the status quo, does it not, for a while?
I was going to say the only other comment I would add is Israel. Israel, it was a surprise attack. Israel came back and did very well, but at the same time, Israel realizes it cannot continue to sustain large-scale wars and battles like this. This is extraordinarily costly. Even if the United States is selling arms to them, it's just so Israel's beginning to think. As early as the after the Yom Kippur War, is that perhaps we might need to start negotiating. We might need to do that. And Anwar al-Sadat took over. Nasser
he passed away.
He had died shortly after the whole Black September thing in 1970, the Jordanian war there, and he'd helped negotiate it into that. And then in the hotel the next day, he had a massive heart attack. But so Israel realized we can't sustain large-scale wars like this. We just can't do that. And so it may be in our interest to do something. Anwar al-Sadat, who had taken over, been kind of the vice president for Nasser, also is beginning to realize, this is really costly for Egypt. We can find better ways to spend our money. And so he's starting to think perhaps the unthinkable, and that is aid. He doesn't like being the puppet of the Soviet Union. That's probably, but aid from the United States would help really make things better. And the United States is kind of dangling that carrot. Is that, hey, if we have some type of talks, negotiations, then Egypt, which has kind of been leading the charge against Israel, because it's been seen since with Nasser as the main Arab nationalist movement, you might knock Egypt out of the equation. You already kind of got Jordan knocked out, maybe now you can knock Egypt out.
Yeah. And that's basically where you start to see Egypt and Israeli's foreign policy changing. Israel is looking to maybe do unilateral agreements with various Arab nations to at least get recognition of their existence. And Egypt, as you pointed out, is realizing we can't afford this anymore. We don't necessarily need this fighting anymore. And so they start looking for ways to calm the situation down and come up with these bilateral agreements. At that point, they start having secret negotiations. They start talking about how we can settle the territorial disputes, maybe address some Palestinian settlement issues. At the same time, here in the U.S., you have a change of Gerald Ford leaving office and Jimmy Carter coming in, and one of his guiding principles was humanitarian efforts. So he starts putting feelers out, and through a series of secret meetings, it starts to become very clear that Anwar Sadat is willing to make some sort of movement in favor of Israel, not necessarily give them everything they want, but make peace. He is invited to speak in front of the Israelis, basically their Congress, and the Knesset is what they're called. And he gives a speech where basically he says, I think we can solve our differences. We've just got to meet and discuss it. Jimmy Carter takes advantage of this, invites them to Camp David. So you get Anwar Sadat, and you get
Menachem Begin.
Thank you, who is at that point the Prime Minister of Israel, together. And I think it was an 11-day conference, very closed door, very secretive. When they end up with the Camp David Accords. The Camp David Accords is basically a reiteration of the UN agreements of partition, where Egypt is agreeing to recognize the state of Israel, which is important. In fact, this was the first time an Arab leader was caught shaking hands in public with an Israeli leader, so that was in and of itself pretty important.
Right.
In exchange, Israel agreed to stay out of the Sinai Peninsula, and they agreed to continue conversations about what to do with the Palestinians. Palestinians were not involved in any of these conversations. There were problems coming out of this agreement. It was hailed as a major piece of international peace and negotiations, but there were problems. The rest of the Arab League were angry that Anwar Sadat had done any of this. In fact, there are calls for his assassination following this, and they in fact succeed in 82?
81.
81. The other problem was Anwar Sadat chose to speak for the Jordanian king, claiming that he would help with the Palestinian issues. The Jordanian king was not happy about that.
Right.
And the agreement was to respect each other's territorial integrity. The problem with that is you still have these cross-border problems that are not in any way controllable by either of these entities. So while it could have been something really great, it turned out not to be that great. Like I said, Sadat is assassinated 3-4 years later. And Menachem Begin is voted out of office. Am I correct?
Out of office,
and that is really because radical elements in Israel and Egypt and all across the Arab nation did not like this agreement at all.
Now, they both won the Nobel Peace Prize, right?
All three of them, I think, did.
Yeah.
Which should indicate the problems. You have moderates in every one of these groups that want to find a solution. And then you have radicals that want the destruction of the other side. And the radicals are always constantly thwarting the efforts of the moderates every single step of the way. What did I miss about it?
No, I don't think anything. Israel gives back the Sinai and agrees for a certain amount of Palestinian autonomy in Gaza and the West Bank.
Yeah, and they basically agree to recognize that the PLO will be sort of the spokesman of the Palestinians, and that's where they end up with their seat at the UN. Yeah. The reason nothing really happens after that in terms of improvement on the situation other than the assassinations and things is at the same time Lebanon has now fallen completely apart. There's a civil war going on there. Syria is in and out of sort of civil war-esque problems, and as Jimmy Carter leaves the presidency and Ronald Reagan comes in, he's got to deal with all of those issues. And so one of his policies is to basically try to keep a balance of power by stabilizing all the different militaries, with the hopes that if they all have the similar sized militaries, they're not going to fight each other. That only irritates the Israelis, who proceed to label him anti-Semitic, which was really not the case. And leading to American barracks being bombed,
Right.
and all sorts of things in the Middle East. So really throughout the 80s, nothing improves. There's sort of a status quo of mess.
It's a stalemate.
Yeah, and on top of that, the Russians have now invaded Afghanistan, so they're occupied with that mess. And so that sort of leads to 1988 and the first Intifada, which is basically the PLO and the Palestinians have decided to just cause a bunch of problems for the Israelis. And the first Intifada, I always want to say it backwards, Intifada was less violent than the second one, but there was still violence. A lot of anything from spray painting buildings to some car bombs to occasionally lobbing some missiles across borders, a lot of police brutality and civilians attacking police, a lot of civilian on civilian.
Yeah. But we haven't got it really to the suicide bombing. That's more in the 90s.
No, that's really the later, they escalate over the years.
Yeah. But the suicide bombing is going to become a favorite, you might say.
Yeah. Now, does the U.S. get involved in any of this? No, because keep in mind, in '88, Reagan leaves office. Bush comes in, and the Soviet Union is collapsing. So we're a little occupied with all that. So fast forward to '92, the Clinton administration starts working on getting the PLO to actually meet with the Israelis to try to get this all under control. So the agreement was they end their intifada and they start having meetings. They end up in Oslo, creating the Oslo agreements, which created the Palestinian Authority. So this was an agreement that Israel would allow some autonomy in the West Bank and Gaza under the control of a Palestinian Authority, which would be an elected sort of local governing body of the Palestinians.
So up until that point, Israel occupied the entire West Bank?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. They're still technically going to occupy it, but they're going to allow local autonomy. So the Palestinians don't have control of their foreign policy, a lot of their economics, but they will govern themselves at a local level. The PLO dominates the creation of that. So a lot of the PLO members become the leaders of the Palestinian Authority. And the Palestinian Authority will govern over the West Bank and Gaza. And then through a series of other meetings, they have more accords to talk about possibly Israel removing themselves completely from Gaza and West Bank. But because of there's still those radical factions still causing those problems, that never actually does occur. And then that leads to the second Intifada in 2000. That one's going to be a little more violent. As you pointed out, they've already started suicide bombing. They will, at this point, the Palestinian Authority has gotten a hold of some rockets that they're going to be using and attacking into Israeli settlements. At the same time, Israel has agreed to give Gaza and the West Bank to the Palestinians, but within Israel, you also have radical factions who do not want to do that. So they're choosing to move into what the territories are supposed to be for Palestinians, and they're building settlements, and they're moving Israelis in, which is agitating the situation further. Now, keep in mind, these are separate entities from the actual Israeli government, but the Israeli government is actually using tax dollars to fund these settlements. So there is some culpability in all of that. So the Second Intifada becomes much more violent, and through a series of international interventions, by 2005, some agreements are reached and the Intifada ends. And the biggest agreement in that was Israel would, in fact, remove themselves from Gaza and the West Bank, turning that over completely to the Palestinian Authority. There were some concerns about that, but the Yasser Arafat-led PLO promised that they would recognize the State of Israel, which he, in fact, did do for the first time. The Palestinians actually recognized Israel does exist, and promised to recognize their territorial integrity, not to invade, things like that, in exchange for Israel allowing them to have this autonomy. And that worked well for about a year.
Yeah.
And then in 2006, the Palestinian Authority elections in Gaza, Hamas gained control. Now, Hamas is a political party that's also a militant faction. So they're partially terrorist, partially military, partially political party.
Right. Yeah. I mean,
It's very hard to explain
they're
these
they're
groups.
recognized as a terrorist organization by the United
By
States,
us and some Europeans.
European Union, Australia, I think of Japan, etc. But they're the Palestinian faction of the Muslim Brotherhood out of
Yes.
Egypt.
Yeah.
And
Which is a much more radicalized
right.
group. Yeah, and keep in mind, all of these parties we're talking about, they have factions within them that are militant and terroristic, and then they have moderates within them too. And so within each of these little parties, you even have factions. The 2006 elections in West Bank, Fatah wins. Fatah is an organization also sometimes labeled as terrorist, but they're looking to set up a secular government. Hamas would like an Islamic government, and they're now the two entities in charge of the Palestinian territories, and they basically cut ties with each other over them not being able to figure out how to run the Palestinian Authority. So at this point, the Palestinian Authority exists in both places, but it's run by two different factions. So that is not helping the situation. After that, it's just been a series of back and forth lobbying of bombs across borders. Every time Hamas does that out of Gaza, Israel will retaliate with bombs. 9 times out of 10, it's civilians being killed in all of these instances. And after the 2006 elections, Israel decided to basically lock down Gaza. Yeah. And how they did that is they built walls around it. They cut off the access to seaports. Now, the southern border of Gaza actually sits on the Egyptian border. Egypt also chose to cut them off. And so basically the people in Gaza have been walled in. And it's actually quite difficult for them to move about and get out of Gaza. And then Israel controls what gets imported in. Since 2006, that has been the case. The population has fallen into extreme poverty. I believe the latest numbers are 54% of the population live well below the poverty line. Yeah. The average Palestinian income is a fourth of what an Israeli income would be just across the border. And remember, when I say border, these are big walls. Yeah. Like you can't just hop over that border. Right. Throughout this, what is that now? 17 years of this, Israel will constrict and then open up borders and constrict and open up borders in sort of retaliation for Hamas's activities outside. Egypt has also done this multiple times with them. What has caused Hamas's current issues is as they've cut these borders off and they've reduced the amount of importation and exportation. If you can't export, you can't make money. If you can't import, you can't get the things you need in. Access to medical assistance has gone virtually non-existent. You can't get supplies for hospitals. You can't get food in for the homeless, for the hungry. Supplies to rebuild buildings. You can't get stuff like that in. And the idea, and the U.S. does this all the time with sanctions, the idea is if they get desperate enough, they'll behave. That's not the case in the Gaza. Hamas built tunnels to get under those barriers. So then Israel and Egypt start bombing those tunnels. And so it just keeps escalating and escalating and escalating. And in 2014, Israel actually invaded Gaza to try to take out Hamas so that Fatah could win back control. And that just led to, I think, 2,500 Palestinian deaths. It didn't really work, and it just left Hamas able to keep control of that territory even further. Starting in January of this year, Israel did another round of cutting off supplies. They did a few police interventions, gathering up Palestinians suspected of being connected to Hamas, and that has just slowly inched up to October, when October 6th, Hamas decided to attack Israel. They did so by crossing over that border and going to several different places, Israeli settlements. One of them was actually a music festival that they hit, and they killed about 1,200 Israelis. They estimate about 248 hostages at that time. They've taken more since. And they brought them back into the territory that's controlled by Hamas. And of course, Israel retaliated with, what do they call it? Something Sword, was it Operation Sword or something like that? So Israel has now invaded Gaza. And if you look at your maps, the little skinny Gaza Strip, they're in the northern half. They did give notice, 24 hours notice to civilians to get out of the northern half of Gaza. Unfortunately, most of these people are impoverished people who don't have access to vehicles, so most of them didn't get out.
And probably not even access to information.
Information, yeah.
So
they may not have even
targeted.
had. And then they invaded. I didn't check the death tolls this morning, but we're at about 15,000 Palestinians confirmed deaths to just a few hundred Israeli soldiers. There have been a series of bombings that both sides have blamed the other, particularly a hospital, where a bunch of civilians who had been hurt in the original invasion were at. And Israel closed off all the borders, so humanitarian aid can't get in. Palestinian refugees can't get out. And so it became a sort of an international crisis. 10 days ago, the international community convinced both sides to have a temporary ceasefire so that they could get those Palestinian refugees, particularly the ones who are injured and dying, out and get supplies in terms of water and food. Basically, they don't have electricity or anything like that at this point. So far, both sides have been playing nicely. They have been releasing hostages. Hamas has been releasing 10 to 12 people a day in exchange for prisoners being held in Israel being released. They were supposed to resume fighting this morning, but apparently they decided to extend for 2 more days to release more people. But Israel has promised that they will continue to invade, and they're going to invade the rest of Israel, and they are not going to stop until Hamas is destroyed. The problem with that is, and I believe Joe Biden is pressuring Benjamin Netanyahu to not do that, the Palestinian refugees are being taken to the southern half of Gaza. There are 2 million people right now in the southern half of Gaza. If Israel invades, that's not going to be good. Yeah. So until Egypt opens its borders and lets those Palestinians out, I'm not sure what's going to happen.
And Egypt nor Jordan seem really receptive to that idea.
No. And I think it's because they know once those Palestinians have come in, Hamas is going to follow them in. Yeah. And then that just spreads it to further further messes.
And then the other thing, I think I've seen that online, I mean, when Israel talks about destroying Hamas, I mean, although Hamas is a military organization, but it's more even of an ideology, you can't really destroy that either.
Yeah.
So the more Israel actually fights against Hamas, the more people it will convince that Hamas is doing the right thing, and then the more people will create the new Hamas.
Yes.
So what could be some possible solutions to that?
No.
For the
But
future?
you know,
I mean,
if they haven't done the solution, but Israel then is also in a difficult position because, I mean, they had 12 to 1,400 people killed.
Yeah.
What do? Do you sit there and say, well, that's okay?
Yeah.
That's okay that you ran in and did that? And it was particularly, brutal. I mean,
And it was
killing
civilians.
families, and it was civilians, and, so Israel's in that position that there's an expectation that they'll respond. But yeah, I mean, when you've got 2 million people concentrated, the Gaza Strip is the most densely populated area of the world. And when you've got all these people, and so they've had to build up. And so when those buildings collapse in bombing, I mean, all those people die, and you've got 40% of the population is 15 and younger, you've just got a recipe for disaster. But you want to, Hamas's goal is the destruction of Israel. At least they say it is. And but you got to think after a while. I mean, surely somebody will come to say, okay, this is not going to happen. This isn't working. Egypt gave up. Jordan gave up. Syria, well, you never know what they're thinking. But you gotta think to yourself, okay, surely, as Dr. Bruce has pointed out, the more rational, moderate people one day will be the ones that win out. But other than that, I mean, I mean, I don't know what you do when you put. What is Israel supposed to do if 1,400 people are massacred?
Well, and it could destabilize. I mean, Israel's not in the best shape right now. Benjamin Netanyahu is barely holding on to this coalition. That within his coalition, you have some radical elements. It was last week; those radical elements were able to pass a bill allowing more Israeli tax dollars to be given to the settlement movement. So while they're fighting and trying to figure out how to deal with Palestinians, you've got a faction within Israel who's wanting to build more settlements in Israeli territories. And then on the opposite side of that, Palestinian territories, sorry. And then on the opposite side of that, you have moderates who are angry that has happened, and they've had to work with Benjamin Netanyahu because they will never regain control of the country if they seem like they're not wanting to get control of Hamas. So Hamas is also creating an environment to breed more radicalism in Israel as well. So they're breeding radicalism in both sides. And hopefully the moderates can regain control, but
And it's also hard, if you grow up in the Gaza Strip, and all you ever see is bombs from Israel, and you don't have those outside information, of course you will think that Israel is the devil themselves, and there's no hope that you could ever be a moderate.
No.
And then on the other side, on Israel, the same story.
If her cousin was one of those people killed, that's not going to make you want to go hug a Palestinian.
Exactly.
And there are, of course, we forget Palestinians who live within Israel. And they've got full rights as Israeli citizens, etc. But they all tend to. There's no great assimilation there, and that has kind of been one of Israel's policies, not to allow for. I mean,
to be honest, it's very similar to American Jim Crow. Like they have the rights on paper, but the treatment isn't the same.
And they do have, I mean, some representation in the Knesset. They do have, you do see, but there's never been an attempt, even within Israel. And you think to yourself, well, maybe if they worked harder on that to bring Palestinian Israelis, together with, but even within Israel, those two sides have a mistrust.
And I would say most of the Palestinians who are living in Israel are the moderates. They're the ones that we do need a homeland, and that might solve this problem. But they don't have the political power within Israel to facilitate that in any way.
At least not yet.
So that's about where we're at.
Difficult situation.
Yes. And it's been ongoing for you know, what, 80 plus years
Yeah,
now?
I mean, I think if you went back 100 years, if you went back to
Yeah.
the 1920s, when you
Yeah.
have your kind of first migrant waves of Jewish people coming in.
Yeah.
And
So
And
we
there
have
we
no
are.
solution
There
to
we
the
are.
problem.
Of course not, yeah. If we had a nice boat where we could look in and see the solution, that would be
Yeah.
great, but unfortunately we don't.
Yeah.
But at least we were able to explain the problem, and we could explain the history of it at least, and now you guys also know where we're at and how did we even get there. So we will see what's gonna happen during
Yeah.
the next
Yeah.
few days,
Days,
weeks,
weeks,
months, and then years and decades,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
centuries.
Yeah.
Probably I won't be there anymore at that point. But it's an ongoing conflict, and let's hope for the best. Definitely. Thank you guys so much for joining
Thank
me,
you for having
Laura
us.
Endicott and Dr. Becky Bruce.
Thank you.
And you guys have a wonderful day. Thank you for joining us, and goodbye.